They had been told the Americans were bluffing. Every Soviet tanker who graduated from the Kazan Armor School in the late 1970s learned the same thing. The T-72 was the pride of the motherland. Fast, simple, brutal, unstoppable. A machine that could crush NATO's armored divisions long before they reached the Rhine. And for a long time, they believed it. Stories filtered in from Warsaw Pact exercises. Polish crews joking that American tanks were overweight tractors. East German instructors mocking Western optics. Soviet officers repeating the same line with iron confidence. If war comes, the T-72 will finish them in a week. Back then, no one in the USSR had ever actually seen the thing the Americans claimed would change armored warfare forever. A tank whispered about inside NATO training manuals, as if it were not a vehicle, but a creature. The M1 Abrams prototype. Only a few blurry satellite photos existed, and even those were dismissed as propaganda. But something strange happened in 1981. A classified Soviet assessment, now partially declassified, quietly admitted that the Americans might have built something serious. Word spread through the armored units. The Americans were testing a tank with a black glass box inside it. Some kind of computer-based fire control system that could see through dust, smoke, even twilight. The Soviet crews laughed anyway. Computers in a tank, in the middle of a battlefield. Ridiculous. The USSR had its own problems. Supply shortages, engine failures, shell inconsistencies. And even their best officers doubted a computer could survive in the same compartment where a tank crew sweated, swore, smoked, and fired a 125mm gun. But deep inside the Uralvagonzavod Design Bureau, a young engineer named Mikhail Kirichenko wasn't laughing. He saw something the crews didn't. Intercepted reports from East German observation teams. Reports describing something that should have been impossible, but wasn't. Laser rangefinders that locked instantly. Thermal sights that cut through fog like searchlights. A gun that could stay zeroed even when the tank was moving at full speed. Kirichenko tried warning his superiors, but he was told to stay quiet. His concerns were unpatriotic. The T-72 was more than enough. So he did what every Soviet engineer did back then. He stopped talking, but he never forgot those reports. Neither did the Soviet military intelligence officer who first read them. A man who would vanish from records after 1982, leaving behind only a single note in a classified briefing. If these reports are correct, the Americans have achieved a fire control advantage unprecedented in tank warfare. Still, the Soviet tankers laughed. Until the day the laughter ended. Because in 1982, at a remote desert test range in the Middle East, far from journalists, far from the public, something happened that even the CIA didn't fully understand until years later. A group of Soviet-trained T-72 crews arrived expecting a routine demonstration. What they witnessed instead turned their confidence into silence. Across the valley stood an early model M1 Abrams, loaned to an allied nation for field evaluation. The crews didn't think much of it. It looked bulky, too clean, too American. But then the test began. A T-72 fired first. A typical opening move, meant to show that the Soviet gun still had teeth. The Abrams didn't fire back. Not yet. Instead, its turret moved with a smoothness the crews had never seen before. Not mechanical, not hydraulic, but deliberate, like the tank was thinking. Then the American instructor gave the order. The Abrams fired. The round traveled across 3 kilometers of desert and smashed directly into the T-72's glasses. A hit so precise that the observers were convinced it had to be staged. The T-72 crew inside survived. But their pride didn't. Another shot was fired, another perfect hit, then another. By the end of the test, the Soviet crews were silent. The laughter was gone, because for the first time, they understood something the engineers had feared for years. The Americans hadn't just built a better tank. They had built a tank that could see, at distances where the T-72 was still guessing. A tank that didn't need luck. A tank that didn't need prayer. A tank that could kill before the other side even knew it was seen. And for the first time since the Cold War began, the Soviet Union realized it might lose the next war before it even started. The Soviet crews didn't speak for a long time. They stood near their T-72s, hands on the still warm armor, watching the American tank idle like a machine that knew it had done something extraordinary. The desert wind blew grit across the valley, covering the fresh impact marks left by the Abrams rounds, each one placed with mathematical precision. The instructors tried to downplay what had happened. They blamed angles, blamed range estimation, blamed the sun, but excuses only last until the truth demands attention. And in 1982, the truth was impossible to ignore. The Abrams hadn't just outshot the T-72. It had performed like a weapon system operating on a different generation of warfare, one the Soviet Union wasn't prepared to fight. The Soviet crews returned home, and their quiet reports went upward through officers who didn't want to believe them. And for a while, those reports were buried. But the military intelligence officer reviewing them saw something the generals didn't. He saw a pattern. Across the Middle East, Africa, and Europe, whispers were spreading. A tank that hit moving targets like they were standing still. A gun whose stabilization barely drifted at full speed. A thermal sight that detected engines hidden behind dunes. A computer that could track an enemy tank before the human eye found it. It wasn't just a new vehicle. It was a battlefield sensor platform, built around a gun, and the Soviets hadn't built anything like it. Still, Moscow publicly dismissed the Abrams as overly complex, fragile, fuel-hungry, a toy of American engineers disconnected from the realities of war. But deep inside a restricted facility outside Nizhny Tagil, engineers were quietly panicking, because they had seen something the Soviet tankers never would. An intercepted American test summary that contained a single line that felt like a death sentence. Engagement success at 3,000 meters, near 100%. 3,000 meters. That number kept circulating through design offices and intelligence briefings like a ghost. Because at 3,000 meters, the T-72 wasn't just inaccurate. It was effectively blind. Dust, heat shimmer, crude sights, manual ranging. But the Abrams? It saw through everything. The Soviet Union now faced a terrifying question. How do you fight an enemy who can kill you before you even know you're in range? But the real shock hadn't arrived yet. It came 2 years later. By accident. The document that shouldn't exist in 1984. An East German intelligence officer smuggled out a reel of film. It contained footage shot during a NATO nightfire demonstration in West Germany, footage that should have been routine. Except it wasn't, because the film showed 3 things that rewrote everything the Soviets believed about Western tank warfare. The Abrams didn't wait for targets to appear. It acquired them. It hit targets using thermal sights long before the targets were visible on standard optics. Its first-round hit probability at night was higher than the T-72's hit probability in broad daylight. The East Germans included a note that sent chills through analysts in Moscow. We believe the Americans have transitioned to a sensor-dominant doctrine. The tank is no longer a gun platform. It is a detection system designed around overwhelming the enemy with information. That sentence terrified Soviet planners more than any weapon. A tank can be replaced, armor can be improved, guns can be upgraded. But doctrine, the way a superpower thinks, is almost impossible to counter quickly. And for the first time since 1945, history shifted direction. The Soviet Union realized it had been fighting the previous war. America was preparing for the next one. Still, none of this was publicly known. The world continued on, believing the T-72 and the Abrams were simply different philosophies of tank design. Until 1985, when a second classified range incident occurred. Except this time, it wasn't a test. It was a battlefield. The day the myth died. It happened in a region where several nations were quietly conducting joint exercises. The kind of exercises never acknowledged, never photographed, and never recorded. A detachment of T-72s advanced across a flat expanse of desert, expecting mock opposition. Instead, someone had sent an Abrams. The crews never saw it, not visually, not with optics, not with spotters. The only warning they received was a single radio call. Impact incoming. A T-72 erupted before any of the others even realized they were being engaged. No warning shots, no exchange of fire. Just precision. Cold, perfect precision. The other T-72s attempted to scatter, but the Abrams computer tracked them through dust clouds, switching between targets as effortlessly as flipping a page. By the time the exercise ended, the commanders watching from the ridge understood exactly what they had witnessed. A doctrine built on overwhelming firepower, rapid advance, and close-range shock tactics, the heart of Soviet armored warfare, had just been rendered obsolete. The myth of the invincible T-72 died that day. It didn't die in the Iraq War. It didn't die in newspaper headlines. It didn't die in political speeches. It died in silence, on a desert range, in an exercise the world still doesn't know happened. And from that moment on, the Soviet General Staff began rewriting everything: doctrine, training programs, manufacturing priorities, because they finally understood the truth. They hadn't been preparing to fight a better tank. They had been preparing to fight a different era. And the era had already arrived. They thought darkness would save them. Night had always been the Soviet tank corps' silent ally, a cover that equalized technology, hid formations, and allowed armor columns to advance unseen. For decades, Soviet doctrine insisted that no NATO tank could fight effectively at night. But in late 1985, during a covert Warsaw Pact observation operation in East Germany, darkness didn't protect anyone. It exposed them. Because when the sun went down and the valley turned pitch black, the Abrams didn't slow. It didn't hesitate. It didn't even switch tactics. It fought better. For the first time, Soviet observers witnessed something their own tanks could not replicate: a tank that turned the night into daylight. And that single revelation would trigger one of the fastest, quietest intelligence scrambles of the entire Cold War. The moment everything changed. It happened during a NATO routine night demonstration, the kind officers usually treated as political theater. But this one was different. A line of cold, silent Abrams tanks waited on the firing line. Their engines rumbled softly, their silhouettes barely visible. Across the valley, metal silhouettes representing enemy armor were placed at distances Soviet tanks couldn't reliably hit during the day. The NATO commander raised a flare. It burst into light, and before the flare even faded, before the sky fully dimmed, the Abrams opened fire. One after another, tanks fired with absolute confidence, not searching, not adjusting, not guessing. Every shot landed. Every target fell. Not one miss. Soviet officers watching through binoculars couldn't believe it. Their own tanks, the T-64s and T-72s, relied on crude infrared searchlights that revealed their positions the moment they activated. Worse, those systems blurred in fog, heat, rain, and dust. But the Abrams? It seemed unaffected by anything. Inside the turret, its crew wasn't seeing the battlefield. They were reading it. Thermal signatures, computer-calculated ranges, target vectors. It no longer mattered if a target was camouflaged, hidden, or stationary. If it produced heat, it was already dead. One Soviet colonel whispered something that became a classified note. "We are blind. They are not." That note reached Moscow within 48 hours, and it set off a storm. Moscow's shock. The doctrine crisis. Within a week, Soviet tank designers, generals, intelligence officers, and political overseers were swept into a classified briefing deep inside the Ministry of Defense. The footage from Germany played on a grainy screen, and for the first time, Moscow saw the truth. The Abrams wasn't beating them with armor, or with a gun, or with speed. It was beating them with information. The T-72 could fire quickly. The Abrams could fire correctly. The T-72 crew had to calculate ranges manually under pressure. The Abrams had a computer that predicted movement in real time. The T-72 hoped its gunner found the right silhouette. The Abrams read the thermal signature of the engine block. But the most terrifying moment came when an analyst froze the footage. A target silhouette hidden behind a sand berm, invisible to naked eyes, suddenly lit up in the thermal viewer. The audience gasped. If this technology spread across NATO forces, Soviet armored doctrine, the largest armored doctrine ever created, was finished. Their entire war plan depended on overwhelming Europe with speed. But now, a single Abrams platoon could stall a Soviet armored regiment long enough for NATO air power to respond. This wasn't a weapon advantage. This was a strategic collapse. The cover-up, the world never saw. Of course, admitting this publicly was impossible. If the truth spread, that Soviet armor was outclassed at night by a margin too large to fix quickly, NATO intelligence would leverage it, and morale across the Warsaw Pact would crack. So Moscow went into its most secret mode, denial by design. Official reports described the Abrams as overly complex, mechanically unreliable, dependent on Western fuel standards, vulnerable to sabotage. None of it was true, but the deception worked. Soviet troops kept believing the T-72 was the future. The world believed both sides were evenly matched. But behind closed doors, Soviet planners ordered extreme measures: crash programs to redesign gun sights, emergency thermal imaging research, massive investment in missile tank hybrids, doctrinal shifts toward ambush tactics instead of direct engagements. They were trying to counter a reality they still didn't fully understand. And then came the breakthrough. A single sentence in a classified intelligence intercept. Abrams' thermal and FCS capabilities represent a generational leap. They are built for a war we have not prepared to fight. That was the moment when the Cold War's armored balance finally broke, not in a battlefield, but in a darkened screening room in Moscow. The mystery that could not be explained yet. One thing continued to haunt Soviet analysts. They understood how the Abrams saw so clearly. They understood how it hit targets no Soviet tank could. They understood how its computer outperformed human reaction. But there was a question no engineer could answer. How did the Americans get this far ahead? This fast? Thermal imaging at this scale shouldn't have existed until the late 1990s. Fire control systems this accurate shouldn't have worked outside controlled tests. Range finding at this distance shouldn't have been reliable in battlefield chaos. Someone, somewhere, had accelerated American tank development beyond anything the Soviets had predicted. But who? How? And why did no intelligence report ever detect the leap happening? Some analysts suggested espionage. Others whispered about classified aerospace programs. A few even suggested that the Abrams wasn't the result of traditional military development, but of an experimental technology pipeline the Soviets had never uncovered. Whatever the truth was, it was too late. The Abrams had already crossed the threshold. The battlefield was no longer a contest of armor. It was a contest of information dominance. And the Soviets were on the wrong side of history. The paradox was simple. According to every Soviet intelligence model, every production estimate, and every technological forecast, the M1 Abrams should not have existed in 1980. Not in that form. Not with that fire control system. Not with that thermal sight. Not with that accuracy. NATO wasn't supposed to be capable of building such a machine until at least the late 1990s. Every model said the same thing. Yet here it was, decades early. And in late 1986, as Soviet analysts gathered inside a sealed briefing room at Kubinka, the question on everyone's mind was terrifying. What else were the Americans building that shouldn't exist yet? The document that started a quiet war. The document that started a quiet war, a newly intercepted technical document smuggled from a West German depot, confirmed their worst fears. Inside was a detailed evaluation stating that the Abrams targeting computer had been upgraded again, now capable of calculating first-round hits while the tank was moving over uneven terrain. This upgrade effectively erased the last Soviet advantage. The T-72 and T-80 relied on stopping to fire accurately. The Abrams no longer needed to. An analyst summed it up in one cold sentence. We cannot outshoot a tank that refuses to stand still. But even more concerning was a footnote. Small, easily overlooked. Compatible with future data link integration. Data link. The Soviets stared at the phrase as if it were a weapon. If true, the Abrams was not just a tank. It was going to be part of a network, a battlefield system where tanks shared targeting data, enemy positions, thermal signatures, and firing solutions instantly without radio chatter. If NATO achieved that, Soviet armored doctrine, the biggest armored doctrine ever created, would collapse overnight. The Kremlin responded the only way it could. It initiated Project Snowfield, a covert crash effort to understand how American tank technology had leaped so far forward. What they discovered didn't calm anyone. Where did the leap come from? Teams of engineers dug through decades of intelligence archives, hoping to find the moment NATO overtook them. But there was no moment, no prototype, no experimental branch, no test series. The Abrams appeared in intelligence reports like a fully formed weapon. One engineer described it as a design that skipped 15 years of development. Soviet officers joked darkly that maybe NASA built it in secret. But some analysts weren't joking. They proposed a theory. While the Soviets had watched NATO's public development, the debates, the prototypes, the budget fights, the US had quietly diverted its real research into hidden programs linked to aerospace and missile technology. If that was true, the Abrams wasn't a tank. It was a byproduct of an entirely different military ecosystem. One the Soviets had failed to detect. The panic at Kubinka. The final blow came during a restricted live-fire test involving a captured export model T-72. The goal: simulate an Abrams engagement profile. A Soviet crew lined up the shot at 1,600 meters, a normal combat distance. They missed. They tried again. Missed. They tried a third time. Another miss. All while standing still. By the end of the test, frustration turned into dread. If a T-72 struggled to hit a stationary target under perfect conditions, how could it ever face a tank firing on the move with thermal sights at more than twice the range? A silence settled over the test range. Not anger, not embarrassment, fear. Because the officers weren't comparing machines anymore. They were comparing eras. The countermeasures that weren't enough. Desperate, the Kremlin ordered emergency upgrades. New reactive armor, laser rangefinders improved, night optics, revised turret stabilization, faster autoloaders. But these changes only addressed surface-level problems. The real issue was deeper. The Abrams wasn't designed for the same battlefield. It belonged to a future where information outweighed armor, where computers outperformed crew instincts, where visibility was the deadliest weapon of all. Soviet planners privately admitted the truth. We can modernize the T-72. We cannot modernize the past. And that past was rapidly closing in. The greatest paradox of the entire saga was this: the Abrams never fought the Soviet Union. Not once. Not in a single battle. Not in a single engagement. Yet somehow it defeated the USSR, not on the steppes of Europe, not in a desert, but in the minds of Soviet generals who finally understood the truth. If war ever came, they would lose their armored spearhead before it even reached the front line. And that realization, quiet, internal, and never acknowledged publicly, changed the Cold War more than any missile treaty ever could. The day doctrine died. In early 1987, a final top-level meeting took place in Moscow. Generals, engineers, intelligence officers, and political overseers gathered in a sealed room beneath the Ministry of Defense. A room with no windows, no recording devices, and no official transcript. What happened inside would shape the last years of the Soviet Empire. A senior general stood before them and spoke the words no one wanted to hear. Our armored breakthrough strategy is no longer viable. The Americans have ended it without firing a shot. He wasn't exaggerating. The evidence was overwhelming. The Abrams could see farther. It could hit more accurately. It could fight at night as if it were midday. It could track and fire while moving. It could kill T-72 at distances the Soviets couldn't even confirm targets. The Soviet Union's entire invasion doctrine depended on armored shock. A tidal wave of tanks smashing through NATO lines before American reinforcements arrived. But shock only works if the enemy can't see you coming. And now they could, perfectly. The intelligence revelation that changed everything. Then came the final blow. A classified intercept that confirmed NATO's next step. The Abrams was being prepared for a digital battlefield grid where tanks, helicopters, and command posts would exchange real-time targeting data. A tank network, a battlefield web. The Soviets had no answer. Their system was built on mass, speed, and numbers. The American system was evolving toward information, precision, and coordination. In a single generation of technology, the battlefield had flipped. Soviet armor relied on overwhelming firepower. American armor relied on overwhelming accuracy. Soviet doctrine relied on removing uncertainty. American doctrine used uncertainty as a weapon. Soviet tanks searched for targets. American tanks knew where they were. Once this shift became undeniable, Soviet planners made a decision that historians still overlook. They quietly began to scale back armored invasion scenarios in Europe. Not out of diplomacy, but out of survival. The silent arms race that followed. Behind closed doors, the USSR scrambled to revive parity, accelerating T-80 production, rushing thermal imaging research, drafting emergency modernization plans, funding classified counter Abrams units. But it wasn't enough. Upgrading the T-72 was like putting modern avionics into a World War II aircraft. Technically possible, tactically meaningless. The Abrams wasn't just ahead. It was operating in a different technological ecosystem, and the Soviets were decades behind. Worse, the truth leaked, slowly, carefully, into the Warsaw Pact officer corps. Confidence in Soviet armor doctrine eroded. A Polish colonel summed it up in a memo that was immediately classified. Our tanks are not built for the war that is coming. They are built for the war we wish still existed. The quiet collapse. In late 1989, as the Soviet Union struggled under economic pressure, political turmoil, and the weight of its own stagnation, one final classified analysis circulated through the General Staff. It didn't predict revolution. It didn't predict dissolution. It didn't predict the end of the USSR. It predicted something else, something frightening. If conflict breaks out, our armored forces will not survive the first 72 hours. That was the moment when Soviet leadership finally understood the scale of the technological gap. They were preparing for a war that NATO had already moved beyond. In the end, the Cold War didn't end with tanks burning in Europe. It ended with Soviet generals staring at black and white thermal footage of an American machine they could not defeat. A machine that saw farther, struck faster, fought smarter, and belonged to a future they never reached. The M1 Abrams never fired a shot at the Soviet Union. It never needed to. Because sometimes the most decisive victories are quiet, invisible, and fought entirely in the shadows of the war that never was.